The morning fog rolled across the sprawling grounds of Highgrove House as Charles stepped out onto the stone terrace, his cup of Earl Grey steaming in the crisp autumn air. He had always found solace in these quiet moments before the day's obligations consumed him. The gardens, meticulously maintained and personally overseen by him for decades, stretched out like a living tapestry of his own design. Yet today, something felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that he couldn't quite place, a subtle shift in the rhythm of his carefully ordered life. Camilla had been acting strangely for the past few weeks. Not in any dramatic way that would alarm the staff or catch the attention of the ever-watchful press, but in small, almost imperceptible ways that only a husband of many years would notice. She had become more secretive about her correspondence, often stepping away to take phone calls in hushed tones. Her usual warmth seemed clouded by a distraction that she couldn't quite hide behind her practiced smile. Charles had tried to broach the subject gently during their private dinners, asking if everything was well, if there was anything troubling her. Camilla would wave off his concerns with a laugh that sounded just a note too bright, assuring him that she was simply tired from her packed schedule of royal engagements. But Charles knew his wife well enough to recognize when she was deflecting. There was something she wasn't telling him, and it gnawed at him with increasing persistence. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew his attention as Camilla approached from the house, already dressed for her morning appointments. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years in the public eye. But Charles noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers worried at the clasp of her handbag. "Good morning, darling," she said, rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. The gesture was familiar, affectionate, yet Charles sensed a certain guardedness in her manner. "You're leaving early today," he observed, noting that she was fully dressed while he was still in his dressing gown. "Yes, I have that meeting with the Literacy Foundation Board, remember? It was moved up an hour." Her explanation came quickly, almost rehearsed. "I might be quite late getting back. There's a dinner afterward with some of the major donors." Charles nodded, but something about her tone struck him as odd. Camilla had always been meticulous about keeping him informed of her schedule, often discussing the details of her engagements over breakfast. Today, her explanation felt perfunctory, as if she were eager to end the conversation and be on her way. "Will you need the car for long?" he asked. "I was thinking of visiting the organic farm project this afternoon." "Oh, take the Jaguar," Camilla said quickly. "I'll be using the Range Rover all day." She glanced at her watch, though Charles noticed she had already checked it twice in the past minute. "I really must dash. Traffic into London will be dreadful if I don't leave soon." She kissed him again, this time more hurriedly, and Charles watched as she walked briskly toward the car park. There was something in her gait that suggested urgency beyond simply avoiding traffic. As her car disappeared down the long drive, Charles remained on the terrace, his tea growing cold as he pondered the growing distance he felt between them. The rest of the morning passed in its usual routine of correspondence and meetings with his private secretary. Charles tried to focus on the matters at hand, approvals needed for various charitable initiatives, a review of his upcoming speeches, plans for a state visit, but his mind kept drifting back to Camilla's behavior. He found himself analyzing their recent conversations, searching for clues he might have missed. It wasn't that he suspected anything truly alarming. Charles trusted his wife implicitly, and after all they had endured together to reach this point in their lives, he couldn't imagine her betraying that trust in any fundamental way. But trust and transparency were not the same thing, and he was becoming increasingly convinced that Camilla was keeping something from him. After lunch, Charles decided to take a walk through the house. Highgrove had been his sanctuary for decades, and he knew every room, every corner, every creaking floorboard. It was here that he had retreated during the darkest periods of his first marriage, here that he had found peace in his relationship with Camilla, and here that they had built their life together away from the relentless scrutiny of public life. The house itself was a reflection of their shared sensibilities, traditional English country style enhanced by careful attention to sustainability and organic living principles. Charles had overseen extensive renovations over the years, always with an eye toward environmental responsibility. Solar panels discreetly integrated into the roof design, geothermal heating systems, and water conservation measures that served as a model for responsible stewardship. As he wandered through the familiar rooms, Charles found himself paying closer attention to details he normally took for granted. In Camilla's study, he noticed that her usually tidy desk showed signs of hasty organization, as if papers had been quickly shuffled and put away. A small key that he didn't recognize lay partially hidden beneath a stack of correspondence from various charities she patronized. Charles picked up the key, turning it over in his palm. It was old-fashioned, made of brass that had been worn smooth by years of handling. It wasn't a type he recognized from anywhere in the house, and its presence puzzled him. Camilla was not one for keeping random objects lying about, especially not in her private study, where she conducted much of her official business. He was about to replace the key when he noticed something else that struck him as odd. The bookshelf along the far wall, which had always been perfectly aligned, seemed slightly askew. One section appeared to be protruding just a fraction of an inch beyond the others. Charles approached for a closer look, running his hand along the edge of the shelves. What he discovered made him step back in surprise. The protruding section was not fixed to the wall like the others. When he applied gentle pressure, it moved slightly, as if it were mounted on hinges. Charles had lived in this house for decades and thought he knew every inch of it. Yet here was something he had never noticed before. His heart began to beat faster as he examined the shelf more carefully. There, nearly invisible unless one knew exactly where to look, was a small keyhole set into the wood at about waist height. Charles looked down at the brass key in his palm, then back at the keyhole. The size appeared to match perfectly. For a moment, he hesitated. Whatever lay behind this hidden panel was something Camilla had chosen not to share with him. By investigating further, he would be violating her privacy in a way that felt uncomfortably reminiscent of the surveillance and suspicion that had poisoned his first marriage. Yet the very existence of this hidden space in their shared home raised questions that he found impossible to ignore. Charles thought about their conversation that morning, about the subtle changes in Camilla's behavior over recent weeks, about the increasing sense that there were aspects of his wife's life from which he was being excluded. The weight of the key in his hand seemed to grow heavier as he stood there, torn between respect for Camilla's privacy and his growing need to understand what was happening between them. The house was quiet around him, with only the distant sounds of the groundskeeping staff working in the gardens. Camilla would not return for hours, if her account of her schedule was accurate. Charles found himself questioning even that now, wondering if the Literacy Foundation meeting was real or simply a convenient excuse for whatever she was actually doing. The rational part of his mind urged caution. There could be any number of innocent explanations for a hidden compartment. Perhaps it contained gifts she was planning to give him, or personal mementos from her past that she preferred to keep private. Maybe it held documents related to her children from her first marriage, or correspondence with friends that had nothing to do with their relationship. But another part of him, the part that had learned through bitter experience that secrets in a marriage rarely remained innocent for long, pushed him toward action. If there was nothing to hide, why had Camilla never mentioned this space to him? Why had she been so careful to conceal even its existence? Charles looked around the study one more time, noting the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and casting long shadows across the Persian rug. Everything else in the room spoke of openness and shared life. Photographs of their wedding, of family gatherings, of official functions they had attended together lined the walls and sat on various surfaces. This was supposed to be their private retreat within their private retreat, yet here was evidence of something being kept from him. He inserted the key into the small lock with trembling fingers. It turned easily, as if it had been used recently and frequently. There was a soft click, and the panel swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a space that had been carved out between the walls of the study and the adjoining room. The hidden compartment was larger than Charles had expected, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, with shelves that had been carefully fitted to maximize the storage space. What he saw inside made his breath catch in his throat and sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The compartment was meticulously organized, filled with items that told a story Charles was only beginning to understand. There were photographs, dozens of them, carefully arranged in protective sleeves. Letters tied with ribbon, their edges yellowed with age. A jewelry box of a style he didn't recognize. And documents, official-looking papers that seemed to relate to financial matters he knew nothing about. Charles reached for the photographs first, his hands shaking slightly as he removed them from their protective covering. The first few showed Camilla at various ages, some from before he had known her, others from periods when they had been apart. But it was the fourth photograph that made his knees weak and forced him to steady himself against the bookshelf. The image showed Camilla in a wedding dress, but not the dress she had worn when they married. This was different, more elaborate, and clearly from many years earlier. She was standing next to a man Charles didn't recognize, both of them smiling radiantly at the camera. The date stamp in the corner indicated the photo had been taken 15 years before Charles and Camilla's own wedding. Charles stared at the photograph, his mind reeling as he tried to process what he was seeing. Camilla had been married before Andrew Parker Bowles. That much was well documented. But this appeared to be evidence of another marriage, one that had never been mentioned in any of the careful biographical accounts that had been prepared when their own relationship became public. With growing dread, Charles reached for the bundle of letters. The ribbon that bound them was silk, in a deep blue that had faded only slightly with time. His hands trembled as he untied the bow and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, masculine, and confident, and the date at the top made Charles's stomach drop even further. The letter was signed, "Your devoted husband, Michael," and dated just 3 years earlier. 3 years into Charles and Camilla's own marriage. The content spoke of missing her terribly, of counting the days until they could be together again, of the difficulty of maintaining their secret, but the importance of protecting what they had built together. Charles sank into Camilla's desk chair, the letter still in his hands, as the full implications of his discovery began to hit him. Not only had Camilla been married before in a ceremony that had somehow been kept completely secret, but that marriage appeared to still be ongoing. The man in the photograph, this Michael, was apparently still very much a part of her life. Charles thought back over their years together, searching his memory for any sign that might have hinted at this deception. Had there been unexplained absences? Phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room? References to old friends that were quickly changed to other topics? As he sat there, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's double life, Charles felt something fundamental shift inside him. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship, the belief that they had moved beyond the secrecy and deception that had characterized so much of their early relationship, crumbled like a dam giving way to flood waters. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that if Camilla had been capable of hiding something this significant, this central to her very identity, then what else might she be concealing? How much of the life they had built together was real, and how much was simply another carefully constructed facade designed to serve purposes he was only beginning to understand? The sound of a car in the drive made Charles freeze. Through the study window, he could see Camilla's Range Rover pulling up to the front entrance. She was returning hours earlier than expected, and Charles realized with growing panic that he had no idea how to handle what he had discovered. Quickly, he began replacing the items in the hidden compartment, his movements urgent, but careful not to disturb the precise organization that Camilla had obviously maintained. As he locked the panel and pocketed the key, Charles heard the front door open and the sound of Camilla's voice calling out a greeting to the household staff. In a few moments, she would come looking for him, and he would have to face her knowing what he now knew while pretending that nothing had changed. The weight of that deception settled on his shoulders like a physical burden as he prepared to greet his wife, wondering if she would be able to read in his face the knowledge that would forever alter the landscape of their marriage. Charles stood frozen in Camilla's study, the sound of her footsteps growing closer as she made her way through the house. His heart hammered against his chest as he tried to compose himself, to arrange his features into the same expression of mild interest he might have worn on any ordinary afternoon when she returned from her engagements. But nothing about this afternoon was ordinary anymore. "Charles, darling, are you home?" Camilla's voice carried down the hallway, warm and familiar, yet now tinged with something else that Charles couldn't quite identify. Was it nervousness? Guilt? Or was he simply hearing things that weren't there, his newfound knowledge coloring every interaction between them? "In your study," he called back, his voice sounding remarkably steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. He quickly moved away from the bookshelf, positioning himself by the window as if he had simply been admiring the garden view. Camilla appeared in the doorway moments later, and Charles felt a jolt of disorientation as he looked at her. She appeared exactly as she always did after a day in London, slightly tired but elegant, her hair still perfectly styled despite the wind, her makeup expertly applied but showing the small signs of a long day. Yet everything about her seemed different now, as if he were seeing her through a completely new lens. "You're back early," he said, hoping his tone conveyed nothing more than pleasant surprise. "The dinner was canceled at the last minute," Camilla replied, setting down her handbag and moving to kiss his cheek. "Something about the main speaker falling ill. I must say, I wasn't terribly disappointed. These donor events can be rather tedious." As her lips brushed his cheek, Charles caught the faintest scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to her clothing. It was subtle, barely detectable, but distinctly masculine, and not one he recognized from his own collection. The discovery hit him like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about where she had actually spent her day. "How was your meeting with the Literacy Foundation?" he asked, watching her face carefully for any sign of deception. "Oh, productive as always," Camilla said. But Charles noticed that she didn't quite meet his eyes as she spoke. "We're making good progress on the new reading centers. I think you'd be quite pleased with the environmental considerations they're incorporating into the design." She moved around the room as she spoke, straightening papers on her desk, adjusting a picture frame, performing the small rituals of someone settling back into familiar space. But Charles noticed that she avoided looking toward the bookshelf where he had made his discovery, as if she were unconsciously aware that something might be amiss. "I was thinking," Camilla continued, "perhaps we might have a quiet dinner tonight, just the two of us? I feel as though we haven't had much time to talk lately." The irony of her words was almost unbearable. Here she was, suggesting they spend time talking, while harboring a secret that rendered honest conversation between them impossible. Charles wondered if this was her way of testing whether he had discovered anything, or if it was simply the unconscious guilt of someone living a double life. "That sounds lovely," Charles replied, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. "I'll ask Mrs. Patterson to prepare something simple." As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself studying his wife with new eyes, searching for signs he had missed, clues that might have pointed to the truth he had stumbled upon. During their early evening drinks in the drawing room, he watched the way she checked her phone discreetly, the subtle tension in her posture when certain topics of conversation arose, the careful way she deflected any questions about her day that went beyond the surface details she had already provided. Dinner was an exercise in controlled torture. They sat across from each other at the small table in the breakfast room, the same table where they had shared countless intimate meals over the years. The conversation flowed in its usual patterns, discussions of upcoming engagements, family news, observations about their various charitable projects. Yet underneath it all, Charles felt the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. "You seem distracted tonight," Camilla observed as they finished their soup course. "Is everything all right?" The question was delivered with such apparent concern, such seeming innocence, that Charles had to fight the urge to confront her directly. But he knew that approach would be disastrous. If he had learned anything from the painful dissolution of his first marriage, it was that accusations made in anger and hurt often did more damage than the original transgression. "Just tired, I suppose," he said instead. "It's been a long week." Camilla reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Perhaps we should plan a few days away? Somewhere quiet where we can both rest properly." The touch of her hand, which had once brought him such comfort, now felt like a betrayal. How many times had she touched him with these same hands that had worn another man's wedding ring? How many times had she spoken words of love while her heart belonged elsewhere? "That might be nice," Charles said, gently extricating his hand on the pretense of reaching for his wine glass. "Though I'm not sure when our schedules might allow for it." "We could make time," Camilla said softly, "if we wanted to badly enough." There was something in her tone that made Charles look at her more closely. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something that might have been genuine emotion, regret, perhaps, or sadness. But it was gone so quickly that he couldn't be certain he hadn't imagined it. After dinner, they retired to the sitting room where they often spent their evenings reading or watching television. Charles picked up a book, but found himself unable to focus on the words. Instead, he watched Camilla covertly as she worked on her correspondence, noting the way she held her pen, the careful formation of her letters, comparing it in his mind to the masculine handwriting he had seen in the hidden letters. "I think I'll turn in early tonight," Camilla said eventually, setting aside her papers. "I'm more tired than I realized." "Of course," Charles replied. "I'll be up shortly. I want to finish this chapter." She kissed him goodnight, and Charles found himself analyzing even that simple gesture. Was there less warmth in it than usual? Did her lips linger a moment less than they typically would? Or was he simply projecting his new knowledge onto every interaction between them? After Camilla had gone upstairs, Charles sat alone in the sitting room, the book forgotten in his lap. The house settled around him with its familiar creaks and sighs, but tonight these sounds offered no comfort. Instead, they seemed to mock him, reminding him that even this sanctuary, this place he had thought of as completely his own, had been compromised by secrets he had never suspected. He thought about the letters he had found, trying to remember exact phrases that might give him clues about the nature of Camilla's other relationship. The man, Michael, had written with the easy intimacy of someone who knew Camilla well, who had access to parts of her life that Charles had thought belonged only to him. There had been references to shared memories, to places they had visited together, to a future they were apparently planning. The financial documents he had glimpsed troubled him as well. Charles had always believed that he and Camilla shared complete transparency about their finances, yet the papers in the hidden compartment suggested she had accounts and investments he knew nothing about. What was the money for? Was she planning to leave him? Was she simply maintaining independence in case their marriage failed? Or was there a more sinister explanation? Charles rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that had given him so much pleasure over the years. Even in the darkness, he could make out the familiar shapes of the topiary, the winding paths he had designed himself, the carefully planned vistas that changed with the seasons. This had been his refuge, his masterpiece, his gift to the future. Now it felt like a stage set, beautiful but artificial, concealing realities he was only beginning to understand. The sound of movement upstairs indicated that Camilla was getting ready for bed. Charles knew he should join her, that any deviation from their normal routine might alert her to his state of mind. But the thought of lying next to her, of maintaining the pretense of intimacy while knowing what he now knew, filled him with revulsion. Instead, he made his way to his own study, where he kept his personal papers and correspondence. If Camilla could have secrets, perhaps there were things about their relationship that he had overlooked or misinterpreted. He pulled out the files that contained the documentation of their courtship and marriage, searching for any anomalies he might have missed. The legal papers were all in order: the marriage certificate, the various agreements they had signed regarding their separate properties, the wills they had updated after their wedding. But, as Charles examined them more closely, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The witness signatures on their marriage certificate included two names he didn't recognize, people who had supposedly been present at their ceremony, but whom he couldn't place in his memory of that day. Charles tried to recall the details of their wedding. It had been a private affair, deliberately kept small to avoid the media circus that would have accompanied a larger celebration. The guest list had been carefully limited to immediate family and a few close friends. Yet here were signatures from people who apparently had official roles in the ceremony, but whom he couldn't remember meeting. A horrible thought began to form in his mind. What if their entire marriage had been a sham from the beginning? What if the ceremony he remembered, the vows they had exchanged, the legal documents he was now examining, were all part of an elaborate deception designed to serve some purpose he couldn't yet fathom? Charles thought about their engagement, about the way it had been announced and celebrated. There had been so much joy, such a sense of having finally achieved the happiness that had eluded them for so many years. The public had embraced their love story, seeing it as a triumph of true love over duty and convention. But what if that narrative had been as carefully constructed as everything else in their public lives? The more Charles considered this possibility, the more plausible it seemed. Camilla had always been more politically astute than he, more aware of the subtle currents of public opinion and institutional power. She had navigated their path to marriage with a skill that had impressed even his most cynical advisors. But perhaps that skill had been employed in service of goals that went far beyond simply winning public acceptance for their relationship. Charles spent the next hour going through every document in his files, searching for inconsistencies or anomalies that might support his growing suspicions. The prenuptial agreements they had signed contained clauses he didn't remember discussing, provisions that seemed to protect Camilla's interests in ways that suggested she had expected their marriage might not be permanent. The insurance policies they had taken out shortly after their wedding included beneficiaries he didn't recognize, people who were apparently entitled to significant sums in the event of his death. As the night wore on and his discoveries mounted, Charles felt his world shifting beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about his marriage, about his wife, about his own life, was being called into question by evidence he could no longer ignore. The woman sleeping upstairs, the woman he had loved and trusted and built a life with, was essentially a stranger whose motives and loyalties were completely unclear. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, and Charles realized he had been sitting in his study for nearly 3 hours. Upstairs, the house was quiet, suggesting that Camilla had long since fallen asleep. Or perhaps she was simply lying there, waiting for him to come to bed, wondering if his absence indicated that he had discovered something. Charles made his way upstairs as quietly as possible, dreading the moment when he would have to lie down beside her and pretend that everything was normal. The bedroom was dark, and Camilla appeared to be sleeping peacefully, her breathing deep and regular. But, as Charles slipped under the covers, he thought he detected a subtle change in her breathing pattern, as if she had been awake and was now feigning sleep. He lay there in the darkness, acutely aware of her presence beside him, wondering if she could sense his tension and suspicion. Every small movement she made, every shift in her breathing, every unconscious sound seemed loaded with meaning. Was she really asleep, or was she as awake and troubled as he was, lying there planning her next move in whatever game she was playing? Charles closed his eyes and tried to slow his racing thoughts, but sleep seemed impossible. Too many questions demanded answers. Too many pieces of the puzzle remained missing. He needed to know more about this Michael, about the extent of Camilla's deception, about what her ultimate goals might be. But he also knew that any further investigation would have to be conducted with extreme care. If Camilla suspected that he knew about her secret life, there was no telling how she might respond. As the hours passed, and dawn began to lighten the sky outside their bedroom windows, Charles made a decision. He would continue to play the role of the unsuspecting husband while conducting his own careful investigation into his wife's double life. It would require patience and cunning, qualities that didn't come naturally to him, but he had no choice. The alternative was to confront her directly and risk losing any chance of uncovering the full extent of her deception. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now planning to deceive the woman he suspected of deceiving him, that their marriage was becoming a battle of secrets and surveillance reminiscent of the worst periods of his first marriage. But Charles no longer had the luxury of taking anything at face value. If his wife could maintain such an elaborate deception for years, if she could share his bed and his life while her heart and loyalty belonged elsewhere, then he had to assume that everything about their relationship was potentially false. As Camilla stirred beside him in the early morning light, Charles forced himself to breathe normally, to feign the relaxed posture of someone just waking from peaceful sleep. When she opened her eyes and smiled at him with what appeared to be genuine affection, he smiled back and wished her good morning, all while wondering if this too was simply another performance in the theater of their marriage. The day ahead would bring new challenges, new opportunities to observe and investigate, new tests of his ability to maintain the facade of normalcy while his world crumbled around him. But Charles was determined to uncover the truth, whatever the cost to his peace of mind or his faith in the woman he had thought he knew so well. The following morning brought with it a facade of normalcy that Charles found almost unbearable to maintain. Camilla moved through her morning routine with the same graceful efficiency she had always displayed, but now every gesture seemed calculated, every word carefully chosen. As she poured his coffee and buttered his toast, Charles found himself wondering if even these small acts of domestic intimacy were part of an elaborate performance. "I have quite a busy day ahead," Camilla mentioned casually as she glanced through her correspondence. "The children's hospital visit this morning, then lunch with the Heritage Foundation Board, and I'm afraid I'll be rather late again tonight. There's a reception for the Commonwealth scholars that could go on quite late." Charles nodded, making appropriate sounds of understanding, but his mind was already working ahead to the opportunity her absence would provide. If she was indeed going to be away for most of the day, it would give him the chance to conduct a more thorough investigation of the hidden compartment and perhaps search for other secrets that might be concealed elsewhere in the house. "Will you need both cars again?" he asked, testing to see if her story about the previous day's transportation arrangements had been truthful. "Actually, I think I'll have Thompson drive me today," she replied, referring to one of their regular chauffeurs. "The traffic has been simply dreadful lately, and I'd rather not have to concentrate on driving." This was a departure from her usual preference for driving herself to engagements, and Charles filed the information away as another small anomaly in the growing list of changes in her behavior. Was she expecting to be too emotionally or physically drained to drive safely? Was she planning to meet someone after her official engagements ended? After Camilla left for her first appointment, Charles waited a full hour before making his way back to her study. He had instructed the household staff to work in other parts of the house for the morning, claiming he needed absolute quiet to review some important documents. The last thing he needed was for someone to walk in on him rifling through his wife's private affairs. The hidden compartment opened more easily this time, as if it had been recently used, and the mechanism was well lubricated. Charles had brought a small flashlight to better illuminate the contents, and what he saw in the improved lighting made his discoveries of the previous day seem almost trivial by comparison. Behind the documents and photographs he had already examined was another shelf that he hadn't noticed in his initial shock and haste. This deeper section contained items that told an even more disturbing story. There was a second mobile phone, one that Charles had never seen before, along with what appeared to be a second passport bearing Camilla's photograph, but showing a different name entirely, Camilla Windsor-Ross, complete with official-looking stamps and visas from various countries. The implications of this discovery hit Charles like a physical blow. Not only did his wife have a secret identity, but she had been traveling under that identity, visiting places and conducting business that he knew nothing about. The passport showed recent entry and exit stamps from Switzerland, Monaco, and the Cayman Islands, all destinations known for their banking privacy laws and discreet financial services. Charles examined the mobile phone next, though he quickly discovered it was password protected and he had no idea how to access its contents. But even the phone's existence raised troubling questions. Who was she calling on this device? What conversations was she having that couldn't be conducted on her regular phone? The very fact that she felt the need to maintain a completely separate communication channel suggested a level of deception that went far beyond a simple extramarital affair. The financial documents proved even more revealing upon closer examination. They showed accounts in multiple countries containing sums that far exceeded what Charles would have expected his wife to possess independently. There were investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and what appeared to be a complex network of trusts and shell companies. The amounts involved were staggering, tens of millions of pounds that seemed to have appeared and been moved around in patterns that suggested sophisticated financial planning and possibly tax avoidance. Most disturbing of all was a series of bank statements that showed regular large deposits with dates that coincided with significant royal events and announcements. The pattern suggested that Camilla might be receiving payments in exchange for information about the royal family's private affairs, or perhaps for influencing certain decisions. The thought that his wife might be essentially selling access to their private life made Charles feel physically ill. Among the papers was a business card that made Charles's blood run cold. It bore the name Michael Thornton, Private Intelligence Services, along with a London address and phone number. Below the contact information was a handwritten note in Camilla's distinctive script. Payment schedule revised as discussed. Discretion remains paramount. Charles sat back on his heels, trying to process the full implications of what he was uncovering. The man in the wedding photograph, the devoted husband Michael, who had written such intimate letters to Camilla, was apparently not just a secret spouse, but some sort of private investigator or intelligence operative. The nature of their relationship was becoming clearer and more sinister with each new piece of evidence. He photographed everything he could with his own mobile phone, being careful to return each item to its exact original position. If Camilla was as thorough and careful as these discoveries suggested, she would likely notice if anything had been disturbed. Charles needed to maintain the element of surprise while he figured out how to handle this devastating information. The sound of a car in the drive sent Charles into a panic, thinking Camilla had returned unexpectedly again. But a glance through the window showed it was only a delivery van dropping off packages for the household. The false alarm reminded him how precarious his position was and how careful he needed to be in his investigation. Charles spent the rest of the morning in his own study, trying to research Michael Thornton and his business. A careful internet search revealed very little, just a basic business listing and a professional website that offered discreet consultation services for high-net-worth individuals and their families. The vague language and minimal information suggested the kind of operation that specialized in activities that couldn't be openly advertised. The more Charles thought about it, the more he began to understand the scope of what might be happening. If Camilla had indeed been feeding information to a private intelligence service, it could explain many things that had puzzled him over the years. The uncanny accuracy of certain press stories about their private life, the way some sensitive family information had found its way into the media despite their careful security measures, even some of the political and social pressures that had influenced various royal decisions. But what was Camilla's motivation? Was she simply being paid for the information, or was there a larger agenda at work? Charles thought about her family background, her social connections, the complex web of relationships that had surrounded their courtship and marriage. Had she been placed in his life deliberately, part of some long-term strategy to gain influence over the royal family? The questions multiplied in his mind, each more disturbing than the last. How long had this been going on? Had their entire relationship been orchestrated from the beginning? Were her feelings for him genuine, or had everything been a carefully constructed deception designed to serve hidden masters? Charles tried to remember the early days of their relationship, looking for signs he might have missed. There had always been something almost too perfect about the way Camilla had handled the challenges of their public courtship. She had navigated the media scrutiny, the family politics, and the constitutional complexities with a skill that had impressed everyone around them. But perhaps that skill had come from coaching, from careful preparation by people who understood the system better than anyone inside it. The afternoon dragged by as Charles struggled to maintain his normal routine while his mind raced with implications and possibilities. He attended a meeting with his environmental advisors, reviewed plans for upcoming charitable events, and even managed to have a civilized conversation with one of his sons about family matters. But throughout it all, he felt as if he were watching himself from a distance, going through the motions of his life, while everything he had believed about that life crumbled around him. When Camilla returned that evening, she seemed more relaxed than she had been in weeks. Her official engagements had apparently gone well, and she was full of stories about the children at the hospital and the progress being made by the various organizations she supported. Charles listened and responded appropriately, but found himself analyzing every word for hidden meanings. "You seem in good spirits tonight," he observed as they shared drinks before dinner. "Do I? Well, I suppose I am feeling rather optimistic about some of the projects we discussed today. It's encouraging to see so much enthusiasm for the work we're doing." Camilla's smile seemed genuine, but Charles couldn't help wondering if her good mood stemmed from successful completion of activities that had nothing to do with children's charities or heritage foundations. "Any interesting developments I should know about?" Charles asked carefully. "Oh, the usual mixture of bureaucracy and genuine progress," Camilla replied. "Though I did have a fascinating conversation with one of the Commonwealth scholars. Brilliant young man from Canada who's doing research on sustainable architecture. I thought you might like to meet him sometime." Charles nodded non-committally, but made a mental note to follow up on this supposed scholar. If Camilla was indeed operating as some sort of intelligence asset, she might be using her legitimate charitable work as cover for other meetings and activities. Dinner conversation flowed more easily than it had the previous evening, perhaps because Charles was becoming better at hiding his suspicions, or perhaps because Camilla was feeling more secure about whatever she had accomplished that day. She spoke enthusiastically about upcoming projects, family news, and various social obligations, appearing for all the world like a devoted wife sharing the details of her life with her husband. But Charles now understood that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. Every warm smile, every affectionate gesture, every expression of concern for his well-being could be part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain her cover while she pursued her real agenda. The woman sitting across from him might be a complete stranger, playing a role she had perfected over years of practice. After dinner, as they settled into their evening routine, Charles excused himself to make some phone calls. Instead, he made his way to a small office he rarely used, one that contained a secure telephone line he employed for the most sensitive official business. If he was going to investigate Michael Thornton and his organization properly, he needed resources and discretion that his normal channels couldn't provide. Charles had maintained relationships with certain individuals in the intelligence community throughout his adult life, people who had provided security advice and threat assessments over the years. Now he needed their help for something far more personal and potentially devastating. He dialed a number he had memorized, but never thought he would need to use for his own domestic affairs. "Sir James? It's Charles. I need to speak with you about a very delicate matter, and I need absolute discretion." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult Charles had ever had to conduct. Explaining his suspicions about his own wife to a man he had known for decades felt like a betrayal of everything he had believed about his marriage. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore, and the potential implications too serious to handle alone. Sir James Worthington had spent 30 years in Her Majesty's Intelligence Service before retiring to a consultancy that served the royal family and other high-profile clients. He was utterly discreet, completely trustworthy, and possessed resources that could uncover information that would be impossible for Charles to obtain on his own. "I understand completely, sir," Sir James said after Charles had outlined his concerns. "These matters require the utmost delicacy. Give me 48 hours to make some initial inquiries. I'll be in touch through the usual secure channels." Charles hung up feeling both relief and dread. By involving professional investigators, he was taking a step that could never be reversed. If his suspicions proved groundless, he would have destroyed his marriage through his own paranoia. If they proved accurate, he would have to face the collapse of everything he had built his personal happiness upon. Returning to the sitting room, Charles found Camilla reading a book, her glasses perched on her nose, looking utterly peaceful and domestic. For a moment, he almost convinced himself that his fears were unfounded, that there must be innocent explanations for everything he had discovered. But then, he noticed the way she glanced up when he entered, the quick assessment in her eyes before she smiled, and asked if everything was all right. Just some tedious business that needed attention, Charles replied, settling into his usual chair. Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow. You work too hard, Camilla said affectionately, returning to her book. We should definitely plan that getaway we talked about. Perhaps somewhere warm where you can properly relax. Charles nodded and picked up his own book, but the words on the page might as well have been in a foreign language. All he could think about was the conversation he had just had, the investigation that was now underway, and the potential consequences of what Sir James might discover. As the evening wore on, and they prepared for bed, Charles found himself studying his wife with new eyes, trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the evidence of deception he had uncovered. Was there any part of their relationship that was real? Had she ever loved him, or had every expression of affection been calculated to serve her hidden agenda? The questions tormented him as he lay in bed that night, listening to Camilla's peaceful breathing beside him. In 48 hours, he might have answers that would change everything. Until then, he had to continue the charade of normalcy while his world hung in the balance, suspended between the life he had thought he was living and the devastating reality he was beginning to uncover. The next 36 hours passed in a haze of forced normalcy that left Charles emotionally and physically exhausted. Every interaction with Camilla required careful calculation, every response measured to avoid arousing suspicion. He attended official meetings, conducted ceremonial duties, and maintained his public schedule while his private world teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Camilla seemed oblivious to his inner turmoil, or perhaps she was simply better at concealing her awareness than he was at hiding his distress. She moved through their shared routines with her usual grace, discussing household matters, upcoming engagements, and family news as if nothing had changed between them. The only indication that she might sense something amiss was an increased attentiveness to his moods, asking several times if he was feeling well or if something was troubling him. Charles deflected these inquiries with vague references to work pressures and minor health concerns, explanations that Camilla seemed to accept without question. But he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him more carefully than usual, perhaps conducting her own assessment of whether their secret had been compromised. The call from Sir James came exactly when promised, 48 hours after their initial conversation. Charles was in his private study when the secure phone rang, and he answered it with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. "I'm afraid the news is not good, sir," Sir James began without preamble. "Your suspicions appear to be well-founded, though the reality is even more complex than you suspected." Charles closed his eyes, feeling the last vestiges of hope drain away. Part of him had clung to the possibility that there was an innocent explanation for everything he had discovered, that his imagination had somehow transformed benign coincidences into sinister patterns. Now that hope was gone, "Tell me everything," Charles said quietly. "Michael Thornton is indeed a private intelligence operative, but he's not freelance as his business cards suggest. He's been working for a consortium of media organizations and international interests that have been conducting long-term surveillance and influence operations targeting the royal family. The operation is more sophisticated than anything we've seen before." Sir James paused, allowing Charles to absorb this information before continuing. "Mrs. Parker Bowles has been actively cooperating with this organization for approximately 8 years, well before your marriage. The initial recruitment appears to have occurred during a financial crisis in her family that was quietly resolved through their intervention." 8 years, Charles repeated numbly. "That means—" "Yes, sir. Her entire relationship with you has been conducted under their influence, if not direct control. The marriage was part of a long-term strategy to gain unprecedented access to royal family affairs, both personal and official." Charles felt as if the ground beneath his feet was dissolving. Everything he had believed about his marriage, about Camilla's feelings for him, about the life they had built together, had been a carefully orchestrated deception spanning nearly a decade. "What do they want?" he managed to ask. "Information, primarily, but also influence over royal decisions and public statements. We've identified at least 30 instances where private family conversations have appeared, sometimes word for word, in various publications. They've also used their access to advance certain business interests and political agendas. Sir James continued with professional detachment that made the devastating revelations even more surreal. The financial arrangements are complex, but Mrs. Parker Bowles has received approximately £15 million over the course of the operation, paid through various shell companies and offshore accounts. The money you discovered is only a small portion of the total. Charles thought about all the times he had shared confidential information with Camilla, all the family discussions she had witnessed, all the state papers she might have glimpsed. The scope of the security breach was staggering, with implications that extended far beyond their personal relationship. Is she? Charles paused, unable to complete the question that would confirm his worst fears. The marriage to Thornton is real, sir. They were wed in a private ceremony in Switzerland 6 months before your own wedding. As far as we can determine, she has maintained active relationships with both of you throughout your marriage. The room seemed to spin around Charles as the full implications of this revelation sank in. Not only had Camilla been spying on him and his family, but their entire marriage was legally invalid. He had been living a lie so complete and comprehensive that it challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. What are my options? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. That depends on how you wish to proceed, sir. We could arrange for the operation to be quietly shut down and Mrs. Parker Bowles removed from your household without public exposure. Alternatively, if you prefer a more direct approach, we have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges, though that would inevitably become public. Charles understood the implications of both choices. A quiet resolution would protect the royal family from scandal but would also allow Camilla and her handlers to escape meaningful consequences for their actions. A public exposure would bring justice, but would also devastate the monarchy's reputation and his own personal standing. I need time to consider this, Charles said. How much does she know about your investigation? As far as we can determine, nothing yet. However, these operations typically include contingency plans for exposure. I would strongly advise against confronting her directly until you've decided how to proceed. After ending the call, Charles sat alone in his study as darkness fell outside the windows. The weight of knowledge felt crushing, as if the very air had become too thick to breathe. Everything he had sacrificed for this relationship, every compromise he had made to ensure their happiness, every defense he had mounted against their critics, had been based on an elaborate deception. The personal betrayal was devastating enough, but the broader implications were equally troubling. How many state secrets had been compromised? How many royal family decisions had been influenced by people with hidden agendas? How many private moments of grief, joy, and vulnerability had been transformed into intelligence assets and sold to the highest bidder? Charles thought about his children, about the conversations they had had in Camilla's presence, about the trust they had placed in her as a family member. He thought about his mother, about the gracious acceptance she had shown toward their marriage despite her initial reservations. The ripple effects of this betrayal would devastate everyone who had embraced Camilla as genuine. A soft knock on the study door interrupted his tormented thoughts. Charles, are you all right, darling? Camilla's voice carried concern that now sounded utterly false to his ears. Come in, he called, steeling himself for what might be the most difficult performance of his life. Camilla entered carrying a tray with tea and biscuits, a gesture of domestic care that would have touched him deeply just days earlier. Now it seemed like another calculated move designed to maintain her cover. You've been in here for hours, she said, setting down the tray and moving to place a hand on his shoulder. I was getting worried. The touch that had once comforted him now felt like contamination. Charles forced himself not to recoil, knowing that any dramatic change in his behavior would alert her to danger. Just some complex business matters, he said, accepting the cup of tea she offered. Nothing that can't be resolved with time and patience. Camilla settled into the chair across from his desk, her posture relaxed and intimate. You know you can talk to me about anything, don't you? We're a team, you and I. Whatever burdens you're carrying, you don't have to carry them alone. The irony of her words was so profound that Charles nearly laughed aloud. Here was the woman who had betrayed him more completely than he had thought possible, offering emotional support and partnership. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. I appreciate that, Charles managed to say. More than you know. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea while Charles struggled to reconcile the woman before him with the knowledge he now possessed. She looked exactly as she always had, elegant, caring, utterly trustworthy. There was nothing in her demeanor to suggest the duplicity he now knew defined her existence. I've been thinking about what you said regarding a holiday, Camilla said eventually. Perhaps we could go somewhere we've never been before? Make some new memories together. The suggestion hit Charles like a physical blow. How many of their shared memories were real, and how many had been manufactured for the benefit of her hidden agenda? Had any moment of their relationship been genuine, or had every experience been calculated to serve her true masters? That sounds lovely, Charles replied automatically, though the thought of spending extended time alone with her now filled him with revulsion. I was thinking perhaps the Caribbean, or maybe somewhere in the Far East. Somewhere warm and private where we can really reconnect. Camilla's eyes sparkled with apparent enthusiasm, and Charles found himself wondering if she was already planning how to use such a trip to gather more intelligence. We'll have to see what the schedule allows, Charles said, using his standard deflection for suggestions he had no intention of pursuing. After Camilla retired for the evening, Charles remained in his study, poring over the implications of everything Sir James had told him. The operation against his family was ongoing, which meant that every day he delayed action was another day of intelligence gathering and potential damage. But he also knew that once he acted, there would be no going back. His marriage, his public image, his faith in his own judgment, everything would be irreparably changed. Charles thought about the various options available to him. He could confront Camilla directly and demand explanations, though Sir James had warned against this approach. He could quietly separate from her using some pretext that would avoid public scandal. He could pursue criminal charges despite the personal cost. Or he could attempt to turn her against her handlers, though the likelihood of success seemed minimal given the length and depth of her involvement. Each option carried enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. A public exposure would destroy Camilla but might also fatally damage the monarchy itself. A quiet separation would protect the institution but would leave her free to pursue other targets. Criminal prosecution would bring justice but would also expose every aspect of their private life to public scrutiny. As Charles wrestled with these impossible choices, he became aware of movement in the house above him. Soft footsteps in the corridor, the gentle opening and closing of doors, sounds that suggested Camilla was not sleeping as peacefully as she had pretended. Was she conducting business on her secret phone, meeting with handlers who had access to the house, or simply lying awake, as troubled by her own deceptions as he was by his newfound knowledge of them? The irony of their mutual sleeplessness was not lost on Charles. Here they were, married couple lying in the same house, both apparently tormented by secrets they couldn't share. The difference was that his secrets were born of love betrayed, while hers were the product of a betrayal so comprehensive it defied understanding. Charles remained in his study until the early hours of the morning, alternately planning and despairing, trying to find a path forward that would minimize the damage to everyone involved while still achieving some measure of justice. By the time dawn broke over the gardens of Highgrove, he had reached a decision that would change everything. He would give Camilla one chance to confess and cooperate in dismantling the operation she had been part of. If she refused or attempted to continue her deception, he would have no choice but to pursue the most aggressive response available, regardless of the personal cost. The conversation would take place that evening, after Camilla returned from her scheduled engagements. Charles would have one final day to prepare for what might be the most important confrontation of his life, one that would determine not only his personal future, but potentially the fate of the institution he had spent his entire life serving. As he finally made his way upstairs to pretend to sleep beside his wife for what might be the last time, Charles felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Kings had faced many crises throughout the centuries, but few had been forced to confront such intimate betrayal while simultaneously protecting the crown from the consequences of their own poor judgment. The woman sleeping peacefully in their shared bed had played a role in the most sophisticated intelligence operation ever mounted against the British royal family. Tomorrow, Charles would have to find the strength to confront her with that knowledge and demand answers that would determine the course of the rest of his life. The final day of Charles's marriage began like any other, with the cruel normalcy of routine continuing despite the earthquake that had shattered the foundations of his life. Camilla rose early for a morning engagement at a local school, moving through her preparations with the same efficient grace that had characterized their mornings together for years. Charles watched her from their bed, studying every gesture and expression for signs of the deception he now knew defined her existence. "Sleep well, darling?" she asked, applying her lipstick in the mirror while meeting his eyes in the reflection. "Well enough," Charles replied, though he had barely slept at all. The weight of the coming confrontation had kept him awake, rehearsing scenarios, and preparing for responses he could barely imagine. "You still look tired," Camilla observed, turning from the mirror with a concerned expression. "Perhaps you should see Dr. Morrison? You've been under such strain lately." The suggestion was delivered with apparent caring, but Charles now heard everything through the filter of his knowledge about her true allegiances. Was she genuinely worried about his health, or was she gathering intelligence about his state of mind for her handlers? Had every expression of concern throughout their marriage been similarly calculated? "I'll consider it," Charles said, though he had no intention of seeking medical attention for what was fundamentally a crisis of trust and identity. After Camilla left for her morning appointment, Charles made his final preparations for their evening confrontation. He arranged for the household staff to be dismissed early, ensuring complete privacy for what he expected to be a devastating conversation. He also took the precaution of having Sir James position surveillance teams around the property, though he hoped they wouldn't be needed. The day seemed to stretch endlessly as Charles went through the motions of his official duties while his mind remained focused on the approaching showdown. He attended a meeting about sustainable farming initiatives, reviewed plans for upcoming charitable events, and even managed to conduct a coherent telephone conversation with one of his sons about family matters. But throughout it all, he felt like an actor playing a role, going through familiar movements while his real self remained consumed by the magnitude of what he was about to confront. Camilla returned to Highgrove in the late afternoon, appearing relaxed and satisfied with her day's accomplishments. She spoke enthusiastically about the children she had met at the school, the teachers she had spoken with, and the progress being made in various educational initiatives she supported. Her apparent genuine pleasure in the work made Charles wonder, perhaps for the last time, whether there had been any authentic aspects to their shared life. "Shall we have drinks in the garden?" Camilla suggested as they settled into their evening routine. "It's such a lovely evening, and we've barely had time to enjoy the outdoors lately." Charles agreed, though the setting hardly mattered for what he had to say. They made their way to the terrace overlooking the gardens that had given Charles so much pleasure over the years. The late sunlight cast long shadows across the carefully manicured landscape, creating a scene of almost painful beauty that would forever be associated in his memory with the destruction of his marriage. Camilla settled into her usual chair with a gin and tonic, commenting on the progress of the autumn plantings and the success of their environmental initiatives. Charles listened with half his attention while the other half focused on finding the courage to begin the conversation that would change everything. "Camilla," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "We need to talk about some things that have come to my attention." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the moment, because her relaxed posture shifted subtly, and her eyes became more focused on his face. "Of course," she said carefully. "What's troubling you?" Charles had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but now that it had arrived, he found himself struggling to find the right words. How did one accuse one's wife of conducting an 8-year espionage operation against their own family? How did one confront such complete and comprehensive betrayal? "I've discovered some things about your activities that deeply concern me," Charles began. "Things that suggest our marriage may not be what I believed it to be." Camilla's expression didn't change dramatically, but Charles caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of her shoulders. These were the reactions of someone preparing for a confrontation they had long anticipated. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," she said, her voice maintaining its usual warmth despite the tension Charles could now detect beneath the surface. "I found the hidden compartment in your study," Charles said quietly. "I've seen the photographs, the letters, the financial documents. I know about Michael Thornton and the organization he represents." For a moment, complete silence settled over the terrace. Camilla sat perfectly still, her drink forgotten in her hand, her gaze fixed on Charles's face. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, colder, more calculating, stripped of the warmth that had characterized their years together. "How much do you know?" she asked. The question confirmed everything Charles had feared. There was no denial, no surprise, no protest of innocence. Just a cool assessment of how much damage had been done to her operation. "Enough," Charles replied. "I know about the intelligence gathering, the financial arrangements, your marriage to Thornton. I know that everything between us has been a lie from the beginning." Camilla set down her drink with deliberate care, her movements controlled and precise. When she looked at Charles again, it was with eyes that seemed to belong to a complete stranger. "Not everything," she said quietly. "My feelings for you were never entirely fabricated. But they were compromised by your loyalties to others," Charles said, his voice heavy with the weight of betrayal. How can I believe anything you say now? You can't, Camilla admitted with a candor that was almost refreshing after years of deception. And I don't expect you to. But you deserve to understand how this happened. Charles waited, uncertain whether he wanted to hear explanations that might only deepen his pain. The initial approach was financial, Camilla began, her voice taking on a matter-of-fact tone. My family was facing bankruptcy 8 years ago, and the traditional sources of assistance had been exhausted. Thornton's organization offered a solution that seemed relatively harmless, simply maintaining awareness of certain social and family dynamics that might be of interest to their clients. Their clients being media organizations and foreign interests looking to influence British policy, Charles said, drawing on the information Sir James had provided. Among others, Camilla confirmed. The arrangement evolved gradually. What began as occasional observations became more systematic reporting. The financial incentives grew larger, and the expectations became more specific. And your marriage to me was originally genuine on my part, Camilla said, though Charles detected something that might have been regret in her voice. The organization saw an opportunity and encouraged it, certainly, but my initial feelings for you were real. Initial feelings, Charles repeated bitterly. What about later? What about our wedding day? Our life together? Camilla was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens that had witnessed so many moments of apparent happiness between them. It became increasingly difficult to separate my genuine feelings from my professional obligations, she said finally. After a while, I'm not sure even I knew which was which. The honesty was devastating, confirming Charles's worst fears about the authenticity of their relationship. Everything he had treasured, every moment of intimacy and connection, had been tainted by her divided loyalties. The intelligence you provided, Charles said, how much damage has been done? That's not for me to assess, Camilla replied. But I can tell you that nothing I reported was intended to cause serious harm to you or your family. Most of it was social intelligence, relationship dynamics, personal preferences, scheduling information. Most of it, Charles repeated. What about the rest? Camilla hesitated, and Charles saw the first sign of genuine emotion since their conversation had begun. There were occasions when more sensitive information was requested, she admitted. Policy discussions you had with advisors, family conversations about succession matters, your personal views on various political issues. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Charles thought about all the private conversations he had shared with Camilla, all the confidential matters she had been present for, all the trust he had placed in her discretion. Who else knows, he asked, about our arrangement? Very few people. The operation was compartmentalized for security reasons. I meant about our conversation tonight, Charles clarified. Have you already reported this compromise to your handlers? Camilla's slight smile held no warmth. They'll know soon enough. These things have a way of becoming apparent quickly. Charles realized that she might have been wearing a recording device throughout their conversation, that their entire confrontation might already be in the hands of the people who had orchestrated her deception. What happens now, he asked. That depends on what you decide to do, Camilla said. The organization has contingency plans for various scenarios. And what do those plans involve? For you? Probably nothing dramatic. Exposing the operation would be as damaging to you as it would be to us. They're betting you'll choose a quiet separation over a public scandal. Charles understood the calculation. His own reputation would be devastated by revelations about his complete failure to detect his wife's duplicity. The monarchy itself would suffer enormous damage from the security implications. The safest course would be to quietly end the marriage and try to contain the fallout. And what do you want? Charles asked. Camilla considered the question seriously before answering. I want to disappear quietly and try to rebuild some kind of authentic life for myself. This operation has consumed me for 8 years. I've forgotten who I am beneath all the deception. There was something in her voice that suggested genuine weariness, a fatigue that went beyond the stress of their confrontation. For the first time since learning of her betrayal, Charles felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. The financial arrangements, he said. Will they continue? I have enough to be independent, Camilla replied. I won't need to maintain contact with the organization if I don't choose to. But the intelligence operation will continue with other targets? That's not my decision to make. Charles understood that she was telling him this operation was larger than their marriage, that other members of his family or social circle might be similarly compromised. The thought was terrifying. I want their complete withdrawal from any operations targeting my family, Charles said firmly. That's my price for handling this quietly. I can carry that message, Camilla said. But I can't guarantee they'll agree. Then, make sure they understand the alternative, Charles said with steel in his voice. If I detect any continued surveillance or influence operations, I'll expose everything, regardless of the personal cost. They sat in silence as the sun set behind the trees, both contemplating the ruins of what had once seemed like a perfect marriage. The gardens that had given Charles such joy now seemed like a stage set for the final act of an elaborate deception. When will you leave? Charles asked finally. Tonight, Camilla said. It's better for both of us if I'm not here when the arrangements are being made. Charles nodded, understanding that their life together was ending with the same calculated efficiency that had characterized its hidden reality. One last question, he said as Camilla rose to go inside and pack. Was there ever a moment when you considered telling me the truth? Camilla paused at the threshold of the French doors, her silhouette framed against the warm light from inside the house. Every day, she said softly. But by the time I realized how much I had to lose, it was too late to find a way back. She disappeared into the house, leaving Charles alone on the terrace as darkness settled over Highgrove. In the distance, he could see the lights of Sir James's surveillance team, discreetly positioned to monitor the property. Soon, Camilla would be gone, taking with her the last vestiges of the life Charles had thought he was living. As he sat in the growing darkness, Charles felt the weight of loneliness settling around him like a physical presence. The betrayal was complete, devastating, irreversible. But perhaps most painful of all was the knowledge that somewhere beneath all the deception and manipulation, there might have been the seeds of something genuine that could never now be recovered or trusted. The sound of a car starting in the drive marked the end of his marriage and the beginning of a new phase of his life, one defined by hard-won wisdom about the complexity of human motivation and the fragility of trust. Charles remained on the terrace long after the sound of the engine had faded into the night, contemplating a future that would be lonelier but perhaps more honest than the elaborate fiction his life had become. The hidden room had revealed more than Camilla's secrets. It had shown Charles the depths of his own capacity for self-deception and the price of placing trust in someone whose loyalties lay elsewhere. The trust that had been shattered could never be fully restored, but perhaps the painful knowledge he had gained would serve as protection against future betrayals. In the morning, he would begin the careful work of rebuilding his life on a foundation of hard-earned truth rather than comfortable illusion. For now, he sat in the darkness, mourning not just the end of his marriage but the loss of the man he had been before he discovered that love and betrayal could coexist in the same relationship, in the same heart, in the same carefully hidden room.